Sometimes the bravest person in the room isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one everyone forgot was there. Rain traced slow silver lines across the towering glass windows of the Harbor Crest Hotel as downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a blanket of reflected lights. The charity gala on the 52nd floor had already raised millions of dollars before dessert was even served, and every polished smile in the ballroom carried the quiet weight of influence, ambition, or carefully rehearsed generosity. Crystal glasses chimed softly. Conversations floated between marble columns like expensive perfume. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz trio played low enough to sound like another part of the architecture. Evelyn Harper stood near the private exit overlooking the city skyline, grateful for 30 uninterrupted seconds away from cameras and investors. As the youngest CEO ever to lead Harper Dynamics, she had spent the entire evening shaking hands, approving donations, and pretending exhaustion looked like confidence. Her silver evening jacket was flawless. Her smile was not. She lowered her eyes for just a moment, exhaling the kind of breath that only appeared when no one was watching. Unfortunately, someone was watching. 3 men stepped into the narrow hallway leading toward the emergency exit. Their tailored suits blended perfectly with the room behind them, but their timing did not. They positioned themselves naturally enough that anyone glancing over might mistake them for old business associates, continuing an important discussion. Yet the path behind Evelyn quietly disappeared. She remained calm. Years in executive boardrooms had taught her that composure often spoke louder than authority. One of the men offered a polished smile that never reached his eyes. Another casually rested a folder beneath his arm as though the papers inside carried more weight than they actually did. Their voices stayed polite, measured, almost friendly, but something about the moment felt strangely airless. Around them, waiters continued serving champagne. Guests laughed at conversations they would forget before sunrise. Nobody noticed the subtle shift happening only a few yards away. Or perhaps they noticed and convinced themselves someone else would handle it. At table 12, Nathaniel Reed quietly folded the science museum brochure his 10-year-old son had been reading between bites of chocolate cake. Their dinner had been simple compared to everyone else's expectations. They had come because Nathaniel had won 2 charity invitations through the city's volunteer appreciation program after months of driving a school bus and mentoring neighborhood children on weekends. To him, the elegant ballroom felt less like a celebration and more like another place where ordinary people learned to stay invisible. His son, Caleb, noticed first. The boy looked toward the hallway, then back at his father. "Dad?" he whispered, his young voice almost disappearing beneath the music. "That lady doesn't look angry." Nathaniel followed his son's eyes. He didn't see panic. He didn't see shouting. He saw something quieter. Shoulders held too still. Eyes measuring every possible exit. The practiced expression of someone trying very hard not to make anyone else uncomfortable. Nathaniel had seen that look before. He had seen it on frightened children during difficult school mornings. He had seen it in hospital waiting rooms after his wife passed away. He had seen it in the mirror while learning how to become both father and mother for the little boy sitting across from him. He slowly placed his napkin beside his untouched coffee. The chair slid back without a sound. Caleb looked up. "Are we leaving?" Nathaniel offered the smallest smile. "Not yet, buddy." Then, with the same quiet steadiness he carried into every difficult day of his life, he stood. Nathaniel walked with the same measured pace he used every morning when children climbed onto his school bus carrying backpacks that looked heavier than their shoulders. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved. No hurried steps. No raised voice. Just quiet purpose. Behind him, Caleb watched with wide eyes, still seated at table 12, trusting his father the way only a child could. Nathaniel stopped several feet away from the small group, leaving enough space to respect everyone in front of him. He did not interrupt. He simply waited for a pause that never came. The hallway lights reflected across polished marble, while the music from the ballroom softened into little more than distant piano notes. Evelyn noticed him before anyone else did. At first she assumed he was another hotel employee responding to an uncomfortable situation. Then she saw his plain navy blazer, the museum admission sticker still attached to his sleeve, and the gentle calm in his expression. He did not look like security. He looked like someone who had spent years solving problems without making them bigger. One of the men finally turned toward him with polite impatience. "Can we help you?" he asked with a practiced smile. Nathaniel nodded once. Actually, I think I might be able to help everyone. The answer was so unexpected that the hallway grew strangely quiet. Nathaniel glanced toward the ballroom entrance, where waiters continued weaving between guests carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and coffee. Would you mind giving the lady a little room? He asked. She looks like she could use some fresh air. Another man let out a short laugh. We are discussing business. Nathaniel smiled kindly. Business usually works better when everyone has the freedom to leave the conversation. The words landed gently, but they stayed in the air longer than anyone expected. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Throughout her career, countless executives had defended her because of contracts, investments, or reputation. This stranger seemed interested in only one thing: whether she was comfortable. That difference mattered more than she could explain. The tallest man adjusted his jacket and looked Nathaniel up and down. This does not concern you. Nathaniel accepted the statement without offense. You might be right, he replied. But when my son asked me if someone looked frightened, it became my concern to make sure he grows up seeing adults treat each other with respect. For the first time, the men noticed Caleb watching quietly from across the room. The little boy was not afraid. He simply observed everything with the same thoughtful eyes as his father. Nathaniel continued, speaking in the same calm voice. Children remember moments like this. They learn what respect sounds like. They also learn what silence costs. No accusation, no anger, just quiet truth. Nearby conversations began slowing as more guests sensed something unusual without fully understanding why. A server paused beside the coffee station. An elderly couple glanced toward the hallway. A pianist missed a single note before continuing. The evening itself seemed to hesitate. Evelyn lowered her shoulders almost without realizing it. She finally spoke, her voice steady but softer than before. Thank you. Nathaniel looked toward her, not with admiration for her title, but with simple human kindness. You do not have to thank me, he said. You only have to decide whether you would rather stay here or walk back into the ballroom. Either choice should belong to you. For a brief moment, the hallway no longer felt like a place where influence decided everything. It felt like a place where one ordinary man had quietly reminded everyone present that dignity could still enter a room without announcing itself. Nobody moved for several long seconds. The silence became impossible to ignore because it no longer belonged only to the hallway. It slowly reached the ballroom, settling over nearby conversations like a soft blanket. Evelyn looked at the three men again, then quietly stepped away from them without asking permission. There was no dramatic escape, no argument. She simply chose a different direction, and for the first time that evening, no one stood in her way. Nathaniel took a single step backward as well, making certain the path remained open instead of replacing one barrier with another. It was a small gesture, but Evelyn noticed it immediately. He was not trying to become her protector. He was protecting her freedom to choose. That distinction stayed with her. One of the men cleared his throat and forced another polished smile. Miss Harper, perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow. Evelyn met his eyes with the calm confidence that had carried her through years of difficult negotiations. Tomorrow works much better than tonight, she answered. My decisions are always better after I have had time to think. Without another word, she turned toward the ballroom entrance. Nathaniel did not follow beside her. He returned to table 12 as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Caleb looked up with the curious expression only children could wear. Is she all right now? Nathaniel pulled out his chair and sat down. I think she is, he replied. Sometimes people do not need someone to solve their problem. They just need to know they are allowed to make their own choice. Caleb nodded slowly while cutting another small piece of cake with careful concentration. That sounds like what you tell the kids on your bus. Nathaniel smiled. It is easier to be brave when someone reminds you that you are not trapped. Across the ballroom, Evelyn accepted a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne. Her assistant, Lauren, hurried over with concern written across her face. Are you all right? She whispered. Evelyn glanced toward table 12 before answering. Nathaniel was helping Caleb wipe chocolate frosting from his sleeve with a paper napkin, completely unaware that several guests had begun quietly watching him. Yes, Evelyn said softly. I am better than I was 5 minutes ago. Lauren followed her gaze. Do you know him? Evelyn shook her head. No, that is what surprises me. Nearby, an older donor leaned toward another guest. Who is that gentleman? Someone whispered. No one seemed to know. A hotel manager checked the guest registry. A volunteer coordinator recognized Nathaniel's name from the city's transportation department. Another guest quietly mentioned that he had seen the same man helping an elderly couple find their seats nearly an hour before without expecting thanks. The stories were small, ordinary, yet together they painted a picture that money could not purchase. Nathaniel remained completely unaware of the quiet conversation spreading through the room because Caleb had begun describing the model rocket they hoped to build over the weekend. Every detail mattered to the boy, from the tiny plastic fins to the bright orange parachute hidden inside the nose cone. Nathaniel listened as though it were the most important presentation in the building. Evelyn watched the exchange from across the ballroom. She had spent years surrounded by people who competed for her attention. This father gave his attention away freely to the person who needed it most. For reasons she could not fully explain, she found that far more impressive than every speech delivered on stage that evening. Nathaniel believed the evening was over the moment Caleb finished the last bite of cake. He gathered the folded museum brochure, thanked the volunteer who had welcomed them, and reached for his jacket. The gala had never been about expensive dinners or famous names. For Caleb, it had been a chance to see the city from 52 floors above the streets. For Nathaniel, it had been a reminder that kindness could open doors money never could. They were only a few steps from leaving when Lauren approached their table with careful hesitation. "Excuse me, Mr. Reed," she asked. Nathaniel looked up, slightly surprised that anyone knew his name. "Miss Harper was hoping to thank you before you go." Nathaniel glanced at Caleb, then toward the ballroom where guests had begun gathering near the stage for the closing remarks. "That is thoughtful," he answered quietly, "but there is really no need." Lauren smiled politely. She insisted. Caleb looked at his father with the hopeful curiosity that children never bother hiding. "Dad, maybe she just wants to say thank you." Nathaniel let out a soft breath. "All right, we can spare a few minutes." Lauren led them toward a quieter lounge overlooking the Chicago River. The city lights shimmered across the dark water below, turning every ripple into scattered gold. Evelyn stood near the window without her public smile. The cameras were gone. The board members were occupied elsewhere. For the first time all evening, she simply looked like a tired woman carrying responsibilities that never seemed to end. As Nathaniel entered, she turned with genuine relief. "Thank you for staying," she said. Nathaniel nodded respectfully. "Your assistant said you wanted to speak with me." Evelyn looked at Caleb first. "You must be Caleb." The boy smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Your father has raised a very observant young man." Caleb shrugged with a shy grin. "Dad says paying attention helps people feel seen." Evelyn looked back at Nathaniel. "That sounds like something you have said many times." "Probably more times than my son would like," Nathaniel answered with a quiet laugh. The gentle humor eased the room. Even Lauren relaxed. Evelyn folded her hands together. "I have spent years surrounded by consultants who teach negotiation, leadership, and influence. Tonight a stranger reminded me of something none of them ever mentioned." Nathaniel remained silent, giving her space to continue. "You never tried to speak for me," she said. "You simply made sure I could speak for myself." Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. "Everyone deserves that." Evelyn studied him carefully. Most people looked directly at her title before they looked at her face. Nathaniel had done the opposite from the beginning. "May I ask what you do?" she asked. "I drive a school bus for the Chicago Public Schools," he replied. "I also volunteer at the Neighborhood Learning Center on Saturdays whenever they need another pair of hands." Evelyn blinked. The answer somehow surprised her more than if he had revealed an impressive career. "You spend your days taking care of children." Nathaniel smiled toward Caleb. "Children usually teach me more than I teach them." Caleb nodded enthusiastically. "He says every kid deserves one adult who believes in them before they believe in themselves." Evelyn felt an unexpected warmth settle over the quiet room. The sentence lingered inside her long after the words faded. She had built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, yet she could not remember the last time anyone had spoken about success without mentioning profit, growth, or power. This father measured success by something completely different, and somehow it sounded infinitely more valuable. Nathaniel assumed the conversation had ended after a few sincere words, but Evelyn remained by the window, as though she had remembered something important years too late. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The streets below reflected ribbons of white and amber light, stretching toward the river. Inside the quiet lounge, the silence no longer felt awkward. It felt earned. Evelyn reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and removed a simple business card. She held it for a moment without offering it. "I usually hand these to people because I want something from them," she admitted. "Tonight is different." Nathaniel looked at the card but did not reach for it. "Different how?" She smiled, almost embarrassed by the question. "I would like to know someone who reminds me that the world is larger than board meetings." Nathaniel chuckled softly. "I am afraid my world mostly consists of yellow school buses, science homework, grocery lists, and trying not to burn pancakes on Saturday mornings." Caleb grinned. "He burns them almost every Saturday." Nathaniel laughed. "Thank you for protecting my reputation." Even Evelyn laughed, and the sound surprised her. Lauren had worked beside her for nearly 6 years. She could count on one hand the number of times she had heard her employer laugh without forcing it. Evelyn finally extended the card. "If you ever need anything, please call me." Nathaniel accepted it politely, reading only the name before slipping it into his jacket pocket without studying the title beneath it. That small gesture caught Evelyn off guard. Most people stared at the company logo first. Nathaniel had treated the card the same way he would accept directions from a neighbor. Helpful, but not extraordinary. "You did not even read it," Evelyn observed. Nathaniel shrugged gently. "I know your name already. That is enough for tonight." The answer lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Caleb wandered toward the large window, fascinated by the tiny boats moving through the dark water below. "Dad," he said, pointing toward the river walk. "Look how little the cars seem from up here." Nathaniel joined him. "Everything looks smaller when you change your perspective." Evelyn quietly repeated the sentence in her mind. "Everything looks smaller when you change your perspective." She realized that fear looked smaller now than it had 30 minutes earlier. Pride looked smaller too. Even the evening itself felt different because one ordinary father had refused to let a stranger feel alone. Lauren's phone vibrated softly. She glanced at the screen. "The board is asking if you are ready for the closing photographs." Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Nathaniel kneel beside Caleb to straighten the boy's untied shoelace. The movement was automatic, patient, and full of quiet affection. No audience. No performance. Just love expressed through ordinary habits. Evelyn suddenly remembered her own father kneeling exactly the same way outside her elementary school decades earlier. She had not thought about that memory in years. Success had filled her calendar so completely that old moments had almost disappeared beneath it. "Tell them I will be there in 5 minutes," she finally said. Lauren nodded and stepped outside. Evelyn turned back toward Nathaniel. "I hope our paths cross again." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Chicago is not as big as people think." Caleb reached for his father's hand. Together they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind nothing more than a quiet room, 2 empty coffee cups, and a woman who could no longer stop wondering why the most important conversation of her entire evening had come from someone who had never once tried to impress her. 3 days passed before Evelyn found herself thinking about the quiet father again. She had attended shareholder meetings, approved acquisition reports, and delivered interviews that appeared polished on television, yet her thoughts kept returning to a man who had spoken fewer than 100 words to her. On Wednesday morning, she arrived at headquarters before sunrise, carrying her coffee through the nearly empty executive floor. Instead of opening financial projections, she asked Lauren to bring her the volunteer guest list from the charity gala. Lauren raised an eyebrow, but asked no questions. A few minutes later, she returned with a slim folder. Nathaniel Reed, school bus driver, volunteer mentor, widowed, 1 son, no public awards, no impressive titles, no connection to influential families. The file seemed almost unfinished compared to the biographies Evelyn normally reviewed. She continued, reading anyway. Every recommendation came from ordinary people. A school principal described him as dependable beyond expectation. A crossing guard wrote that children smiled more on mornings when Mr. Reed was driving. A neighborhood librarian mentioned that he repaired broken bookshelves without ever sending a bill. None of those details would have mattered inside a boardroom. Somehow they mattered to Evelyn more than any executive resume she had ever read. Across town, Nathaniel's morning began long before daylight. The yellow school bus rumbled quietly through familiar streets while sleepy children climbed aboard carrying backpacks decorated with planets, dinosaurs, and cartoon characters. Nathaniel greeted every student by name. Some answered enthusiastically. Others simply nodded, still waking up. He treated each greeting with equal warmth. Caleb sat in the front seat that morning because his school started along the same route. "Dad," he asked while watching the city pass outside the windshield, "do you think we will ever see Miss Harper again?" Nathaniel smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "Maybe. Chicago has a funny way of bringing good people back together." Caleb considered that answer carefully. "She looked less lonely when we left." Nathaniel glanced briefly at his son through the mirror. Children often noticed emotions adults worked hard to hide. "I hope she did," he said softly. "Sometimes all people need is one peaceful moment to remember they are stronger than they feel." Meanwhile, Evelyn closed the volunteer folder and looked through the tall windows overlooking downtown. Thousands of people hurried along the sidewalks below, each carrying invisible worries. She suddenly realized how little she knew about the communities her company claimed to serve. Reports described neighborhoods through percentages and charts. Nathaniel had described people through dignity. The difference unsettled her. "Lauren," she said quietly, "clear my schedule for Saturday morning." Her assistant looked up from a tablet in surprise. "You have 3 events already planned." Evelyn nodded. "Then cancel them." "May I ask why?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Because I want to visit the neighborhood learning center where Mr. Reed volunteers." Lauren blinked. "Without announcing your visit?" "Especially without announcing it." For the first time in years, Evelyn wanted to see people living ordinary lives before anyone had the chance to prepare for the arrival of a chief executive officer. She wanted to understand what Nathaniel already seemed to know so naturally. Somewhere between polished conference tables and quarterly earnings, she had forgotten how quietly real leadership often began. Saturday morning arrived without television cameras, security announcements, or reserved parking spaces. Evelyn drove herself across the city in a modest sedan that blended easily into the neighborhood streets. She wore a simple navy sweater, comfortable jeans, and running shoes instead of tailored business suits. For the first time in years, no one recognized the chief executive officer stepping onto the sidewalk with a paper cup of coffee in her hand. The neighborhood learning center occupied a renovated brick building beside a small public park where children chased soccer balls across damp grass. The scent of fresh mulch and blooming flowers drifted through the cool spring air. Laughter echoed from the playground before she even reached the entrance. It sounded nothing like the polished applause she heard inside conference halls. This laughter was real. Inside the center, shelves overflowed with donated books, science kits, board games, and colorful art supplies. Volunteers moved naturally between classrooms, helping children build model bridges, paint cardboard planets, and solve math puzzles. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody looked at a clock every 5 minutes. Evelyn paused quietly near the doorway, taking in a world that measured success very differently from her own. She spotted Nathaniel almost immediately. He sat cross-legged on the floor beside 4 children surrounding a half-finished model rocket nearly 3 feet tall. Caleb knelt beside him, carefully reading the instructions while another little girl searched for the correct plastic fin. Nathaniel was not leading the activity with speeches or commands. He simply asked questions that encouraged the children to discover answers together. "What happens if we rush this step?" he asked with an encouraging smile. One boy studied the pieces before answering. "It might not fly straight." Nathaniel nodded. "That sounds true for rockets. It also sounds true for people." The children giggled before returning to their project. Evelyn remained unnoticed, quietly watching from across the room. A volunteer carrying craft supplies approached her. "First time here?" the woman asked warmly. Evelyn smiled. "Yes. Feel free to jump in anywhere. We always need another pair of hands." Those simple words surprised Evelyn. Nobody had asked what company she represented. Nobody cared about her title. Here, she was simply another adult capable of helping. She placed her coffee on a nearby table and walked toward an art station where younger children struggled to cut colorful paper into stars. Within minutes, she found herself holding construction paper while a little boy proudly explained why every spaceship needed windows facing Saturn. She laughed softly as tiny scraps of blue paper covered her sleeves. Across the room, Nathaniel finally looked up and noticed her. His expression revealed honest surprise rather than expectation. During the short break between activities, he walked over carrying a box filled with glue sticks. "I did not expect to see you here," he admitted. Evelyn looked around the busy room before answering. Neither did I. Nathaniel smiled. How are you enjoying your Saturday? She glanced toward the children, then back at him. I think this is the first meeting I have attended in years where nobody is pretending to be someone else. Nathaniel looked around the room with quiet appreciation. Children have a way of making honesty feel normal. Caleb wandered over carrying the completed rocket with obvious pride. Miss Harper, do you want to help us launch it after lunch? Evelyn accepted the invitation without hesitation. I would love to. For reasons she could not explain, those 5 simple words felt far more important than every agreement she had signed during the previous month. After lunch, the children carried the finished rocket to the open field behind the learning center. The afternoon sky had cleared into a bright blue, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees just enough to make the small American flag near the playground flutter. Every child gathered in a wide circle while Nathaniel carefully placed the rocket on its launch stand. Caleb checked the safety cord twice before looking proudly toward Evelyn. Would you like to count us down? He asked. She smiled with genuine excitement. I would be honored. The children raised their voices together. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The rocket shot upward, climbing higher than anyone expected before the tiny orange parachute opened against the blue sky. Cheers echoed across the park as little hands pointed toward the drifting rocket. Evelyn laughed with the children, forgetting for a few precious seconds every responsibility waiting on her office desk. When the rocket floated gently back to the grass, Caleb sprinted across the field to retrieve it while the other children celebrated as though they had just reached the moon. Nathaniel watched them with quiet satisfaction. Success looks different here, Evelyn said softly as she stepped beside him. It does, Nathaniel replied. Nobody asks who gets the credit. They only celebrate that everyone helped. Those words stayed with her. She looked around at the volunteers cleaning tables, parents chatting on folding chairs, and children proudly carrying projects they had built together. There was no competition, only community. Evelyn reached into her bag and removed a small notebook she always carried for business ideas. She tore out a blank page and wrote several quick notes before closing it again. Nathaniel noticed, but did not ask what she had written. May I ask you something? Evelyn said after a thoughtful pause. Of course. If you had the resources to improve this place, where would you begin? Nathaniel did not answer immediately. He looked at the building, the playground, and finally at the children. I would not begin with the building, he said. I would begin with people. More tutors. More mentors. More adults willing to listen before they speak. Children. Remember faces much longer than furniture. Evelyn slowly nodded. She had expected him to mention computers or equipment. Instead, he had spoken about people. Once again, he had answered a question she had not realized she was asking. Would you ever consider helping me build something larger? She asked. Nathaniel looked genuinely puzzled. What do you mean? My foundation supports educational programs across Illinois, but I think we have been investing in the wrong things. We build facilities. We buy technology. Perhaps we should be investing in people instead. Nathaniel smiled warmly, but shook his head. If you decide to do that, do not build it around me. Evelyn looked surprised. Why not? He watched Caleb helping a younger child fold the parachute with patient hands. Because kindness only lasts when it belongs to everyone. The moment it belongs to one person, it becomes a monument instead of a movement. Evelyn lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet wisdom in his words. She slipped the notebook back into her bag, knowing the plans she had written only moments earlier were already changing. She had come searching for one remarkable man. Instead, she was beginning to discover an entirely different way to lead. The weeks that followed changed more lives than anyone could have predicted. Harper Dynamics announced a new community initiative, but the headlines focused on the funding while the real transformation remained almost invisible. Instead of building another impressive facility with polished glass walls, the foundation began investing in neighborhood mentors, after-school programs, literacy volunteers, and transportation for children whose families could not easily reach learning centers. Every proposal carried one quiet question at the top of the page. How does this help people feel seen? The board members noticed the difference immediately. Some questioned the shift. Others embraced it. Evelyn listened carefully to every opinion before making her decision. Buildings are important, she told them. But children remember people long after they forget the color of the walls. She never mentioned where she had first heard a lesson like that. Across the city, Nathaniel continued driving his morning bus exactly as he always had. Nothing about his routine suggested that he had quietly influenced the direction of a major foundation. He still greeted every student by name. He still reminded nervous children before exams that effort mattered more than perfection. He still spent Saturdays helping Caleb and dozens of other children discover that curiosity could be stronger than fear. One crisp autumn afternoon, Caleb checked the mailbox before dinner and found a plain white envelope with no company logo on the front. "Dad, this one is for you." Nathaniel opened it at the kitchen table while a pot of homemade soup simmered gently on the stove. Inside was a handwritten note. The paper contained only a few careful sentences. "Dear Mr. Reed, my father came home very quiet after the charity gala several months ago. He told me someone reminded him that respect is never something people should have to earn. He has been trying to become a better listener ever since. I do not know exactly what happened that night, but I wanted to thank you because our house feels different now. Sincerely, Emily." Nathaniel read the letter twice before folding it carefully. Caleb looked up from his homework. "Who is Emily?" Nathaniel smiled softly. "Someone whose life became a little brighter." He placed the letter inside the same small wooden box where he kept birthday cards from Caleb, old family photographs, and memories too meaningful to lose. A few days later, Evelyn stopped by the learning center carrying nothing more than a tray of warm cinnamon rolls from a neighborhood bakery. The children greeted her by name before rushing back to their projects. Nobody treated her like a chief executive officer anymore. They treated her like a volunteer who had become part of the family. Nathaniel looked around the busy room and smiled. "Looks like they were expecting you." Evelyn laughed. "I certainly hope so. I promised Caleb I would help with the next rocket." Caleb held up a fresh blueprint covered in colorful pencil marks. "This one is going even higher." Nathaniel looked from his son to Evelyn and then toward the children filling the room with laughter. "Maybe it will," he said quietly. "But even if it does not, we already built the important part." Evelyn followed his gaze as children from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, and different stories worked side by side, without caring about titles or status. She finally understood what had begun that rainy evening when one quiet father stood up without asking for recognition. He had never tried to change the world all at once. He had simply refused to let kindness remain seated when someone needed it to stand.